is going to be Tim Luecke. He's the author of Why Trump. And Tim was born and raised in Cologne, Germany, but lived in the United States for 15 years, during of which he got his bachelor degree in political science at the University of Chicago, and he's got his PhD in international relations. After completing his dissertation, he worked as a postdoc scholar at the Mershon Center in Columbus, Ohio. Between 2018 and 2020, Tim and a photographer, Sonia Niemeyer, traveled across the United States to interview Americans of all walks of life on why they believe Donald Trump became president. The book will be released on November 1st here in 2021, so just a few weeks away. And it'll be the first part of a three-part series called The Crisis of the West, which tries to understand the political crisis and increasing polarization in Western societies. In 2019, Sonia and Tim co-founded Transatlantica, a network of independent scholars, artists, academics, experts from both sides of the Atlantic, dedicated to the goal to promote transatlantic relations and to developing creative solutions to the crisis of the West. Tim, I want to welcome you to the Rural Progress Summit.
Yes, well, hi everyone. Thank you, J.D. Scholten, for the great introduction. Thank you also to Senator Heitkamp, who invited us to join the conference and is promoting our book. We're really grateful. We're excited to be here. As Mr. Scholten just said already, usually there's two of us. Sonia Niemeyer is the co-founder with me and co-author, you could say, for Why Trump. But she's sitting in the other room next door, so I'm extra nervous because, I better not screw up here. So today we want to talk about our book project, Why Trump? And we have a little visual material there. If Tom could maybe pull this up, that would be great. So I'm going to talk a bit about the book project itself and some key insights. And then I'm going to relate this to the topic of this panel here today, disinformation, misinformation. Let me say upfront, those terms are difficult, I think, speaking as a social scientist. But I'm going to be a little bit provocative and say that, or try to make the case that disinformation, misinformation is maybe not the problem, or at least not the problem you think it is. Okay, let's get started on the book. There's the cover. Sonia and we drove around the country for 2 months. That was the first initial road trip. And there you see the route we took across the United States. We started in Kingston in upstate New York, made our way down the East Coast, and then cut across. Columbus was on the route, Kalamazoo, so not just big cities, Des Moines, Gothenburg, Nebraska, and then all the way to the West Coast. So we traveled about 6,200 miles. And then we did 2 other follow-up trips in the winter of 2018 and 2019. Over the course of this trip and the following trips, we interviewed 50 Americans of all walks of life, as we said already. So here you have an overview of everybody. You see a photo there of Anna Klumsky, some of you might know from Veep, and My Girl. You see Martha Nussbaum, the famous philosopher from Chicago. But we also have some just very regular folks, some farmers from Nebraska, some Latino folks from LA, everybody basically. So this makes obviously for a very fascinating sort of collection of interviews. Why did we do interviews? Well, because the surveys, the impetus, the original motivation for doing this kind of project was obviously the election of Donald Trump in 2016, which came to many of us, including myself, as a complete shock and surprise. What was also interesting about this event is that all the surveys had basically predicted that Hillary Clinton would win the election. So my intuition was there's something wrong with the surveys. So in my PhD education, I was more of the qualitative type, and I sort of could get into a big discussion now what benefits interviews have compared to surveys. But I'm going to spare you that. But basically, just to give you a brief idea, interviews are a much better way to sort of dig into the deeper reasons for, let's say, political frustration, why people feel increasingly frustrated with the establishment, etc. As you can see on the, this is sort of an excerpt from the book. We also worked extensively with photos. And photos have the advantage that you get an impression of the people we actually talk to. It sort of humanizes the discourse, right? That, for example, was a very conservative couple, but you see just two very nice, friendly-looking Americans. And photos, thank you. See, they look very nice. And photos also allowed us to capture the beauty of America. And that is one thing, if we talk about polarization, one thing that Americans from both sides, from the left and the right, can agree on, that they share a love for their country. And we didn't want to just examine the reasons why there's increasing polarization. We also wanted to find a way to bring Americans back together, which is kind of funny if you think about two Germans trying to bring Americans back together. But that was sort of the motivation. So some of the key insights from the project. Let me first, we have the book will be available on November 1st. We are not selling the book on Amazon for some obvious and some not so obvious reasons. But it will be available only on our website, transatlantica.com. And Transatlantica is written with a K. So you'll find it by Googling. Okay, let me get into some of the key insights or some of the surprises. I mean, ideally, you read the book yourself. This is kind of the other idea behind this somewhat unique approach that we took. We didn't comment on the interviews extensively. We basically just shortened the transcripts, edited them a bit for readability. But in the end, we print the interviews verbatim, which means it's also not suitable for children because there's some cursing going on, mild cursing in some cases. So I want to still highlight some of the key insights. There's a lot of material. It's sort of a resource to stimulate your own thinking about the problems that we are facing nowadays in our democracies. And as the subtitle of the book already indicates, we have similar problems here in Germany. We have similar problems in the European Union, and we just lost the United Kingdom during Brexit. So let me just highlight some surprises, some things that we didn't expect. First, if you look at the media discourse that's going on right now, there's a lot of vitriol. There's a lot of animosity going on. People cannot understand why somebody would vote for Trump. One of the biggest surprises we had during the interviews is that a lot of people on the left, a lot of Democratic-leaning voters, were actually very understanding of why people would vote for Trump. So this sort of surprised us, right? Because we also are used to just reading newspapers, being on social media, and you get a very different picture there than you get when you actually talk to these people. Just sit down and, for example, with the farmers you saw there from Nebraska, we sat down at their kitchen table and we just talked for an hour, right? The other insight that I thought might be of interest to especially this audience is that there was a lot of frustration on the left with the Democratic Party, to be very frank. That was partly related to, well, the issue of Bernie Sanders, of course, but also how they treat rural voters, right? So we often heard the argument made by people on the left, but also obviously from people who supported Trump, that the Washington elites in general, but also the Democratic Party in particular, was sort of neglecting the needs, interests, and beliefs of rural voters. So, for that reason, we think that the One Country project obviously is a terrific idea, and this conference is a terrific idea, and I think there's a lot more work to be done. Okay, I don't want to run too long and maybe leave some room for questions. So let me get sort of to the odd argument about disinformation and misinformation. I'm gonna say up front, you might not like to hear that, but I think nowadays, in these times especially, it is important to not just hear the beliefs of people who agree with you already, but also to listen to more critical voices. Right. So the argument I'm going to make is basically that this or misinformation, there is a difference clearly, is not the problem that we might think it is. Right. So clearly there's a lot of fake news, disinformation, misinformation. Though I should caution, it has always been around. Right. Let's remember the infamous time when Colin Powell was standing in front of the UN Security Council and presenting evidence for the existence of weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. That was clearly mis and disinformation, and it has tremendous consequences, right? So we're talking about different type of information here today, I think. One part of misinformation, disinformation, let's call it fake news, is also that we increasingly, and we heard this in the interviews, we live increasingly in a world where we all have our informational bubbles, right? Facebook sort of feeds us the information we like. The same goes for established news outlets, like, you know, if you're liberal New York Times reader, if you're on Fox News, you all know the problem. So it's not only the case that rural voters, or let's say even Trump supporters, live in a bubble. We live in a bubble too. And I think an example for this is exactly the argument that I would make. So it seems to me that especially people on Democratic left, center left sort of thinkers, intellectuals nowadays think if we could only get rid of misinformation and fake news, then people would see the light. They would immediately see the one right way to do things, to the one right set of beliefs, and then they would not be so frustrated, and they would hopefully even not vote for Trump, but vote Democrat. And I think this is actually a problem. This is the real problem of misinformation. And I'm thinking here, especially, it's always good to think about the audience, who you're talking to. So I assume most people who watch right now are sort of Democratic leaning, interested in reaching out to rural voters. And I think this argument that, you know, if we get rid of misinformation, then all of a sudden everybody's like, I see the right way, and the right way is Democrat. I think that's a really dangerous and problematic bubble we're living in. So there are two problems that I see in this line of thinking. So first, many people, most people, I would argue, in rural communities as well, know perfectly well that they're being fed misinformation, right? We all know about fake news. We all know that Fox News wants to give us one message and the New York Times wants to give us another message, right? But if we consistently say, well, if we get rid of fake news, then those voters wouldn't be so brainwashed. The effect that this has is that voters and those people feel like they're being treated like little children, right? Especially because, again, they know they're being fed misinformation. The second problem with the argument is, and the argument again that I kind of constructed there is, if we get rid of all the misinformation, then everybody sees the light. This argument is problematic because it assumes that there's one right way to think, to believe, and to live, right? And this is clearly not the case, right? Rural voters have different sort of interests, preferences, beliefs, and ways of life than people in the cities. Some people want to drive their F-150, even though they do know about climate change, right? So the argument that the whole problem would be solved if we just get rid of misinformation is problematic because it tells those people basically your way of life is wrong, it's immoral, right? So democracy is about coming together with people who have different kinds of beliefs, different kind of interests, and sometimes they just don't like the beliefs that we have, right? That's a very uncomfortable thing. It's a very difficult thing to engage with those people. But to simply say, oh, it's all misinformation, and if we get rid of misinformation, then the problem is solved, actually is going to blow back at us, right? It's going to make Trump stronger. It's going to give him more support, because if somebody has understood this before any of us, I would argue then it's Donald Trump. So, 3 quick conclusions. I think Democrats and liberals in general should stop taking the easy road and blame everything on misinformation or disinformation. I think the argument is wrong, and pushing this argument has bad consequences. You also have a great opportunity. Engage those people, right? Go out, talk to them, and offer them a way to feel like their way of life is also respected. I think that's a great opportunity. How much time do I have? Okay. Second, I have thought about this. I used the term polarization a lot in the book, in the conclusion and in the introduction. I think it is wrong to talk about the current situation in terms of polarization, because it creates this idea of one camp against the other, right? Those are the 2 poles. But we all know at this point that what we're actually seeing here is sort of fragmentation, right? Democrats are split along many different lines right now. Republicans, we don't even need to talk about that. The Republican Party has a lot of problems right now as well, trying to figure out who they are. But I think the term of polarization is problematic because it just reinforces this idea of 2 combating camps. So if my argument is right that misinformation is not really the problem that we're thinking it is, and if the problem is not necessarily misinformation, it's just that people sometimes don't like our views, our beliefs, and opinions, then that implies some good news for Facebook, right? And for all the other big internet companies that are currently in the process of censoring the conversation, the discourse, and sort of content on the internet. The internet sort of lives or exists because you sort of have freedom of expression there. And I don't think, again, that misinformation is the problem we think it is. And then we also don't need to censor everything there, which is going to just get us more animosity from the other side as well. So I kind of rushed through this, but I did want to leave some time for questions. So that would conclude my thing. I hope you're all going to buy the book. It's going to be available November 1st on transatlantica.com. And I'm happy to continue the conversation and look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you. I think we'll give you one question, and I think then we're gonna pass it on to Laura. But before we get to her, so could you? One of the things I think I see where I'm from, the district where I ran in is the #1 district in America where Democratic and Republican voters are on Facebook. We also have independent voters, and then when you add all the voters, it drops a little bit. But we're one of the most on Facebook. What do you see Facebook's involvement in our democracy right now in your journey? What did that come up along the way, or okay?
Yes, that's great. Actually, I accidentally skipped that. That was yes, it came up a lot, especially since we talked to a lot of people who work in the tech industry. So they really know how it's working, and they all say it's a complete disaster, right? They say it's very dangerous. But again, those were mostly left-leaning people, and they also said it's dangerous for both sides, right? Facebook, as we just saw, right, clearly knows what they're doing. And I also asked people from the tech community if there wouldn't be alternative ways to create sort of social media networks, right? And they said, yes, the technical means are there. The problem is people wouldn't do it, right? And it doesn't make any money. And that's also something that we took away from the book, right? In the end, it's all up to us. Who's using Facebook? We are, every one of us, right? So, yes.